for your patience.
No problem.
Maybe Zoom wants to take a break as well on Friday. I don't know. Give me a second.
All right, I'm back. I think I moved closer to my router. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, you sound better already. So.
Okay, let me try this again. Yeah, I've had my internet company out here regularly. Whoops, and can't seem to get this right. Is this sharing again? Yeah. Okay. So last time we just talked about what is culturally responsive research. We reviewed an article that I co-authored many years ago. And we'd had some conversations about epistemologies as sort of just the foundation. And I found this little figure that we didn't emphasize it enough, but had people reflect on their own epistemologies in relationship to this topic. And we can think of these things as being on a continuum. You're not in little boxes. I'm not in a little box here, but the key idea is really, it's important to think through your orientation to knowledge. And maybe that's a foundation, that's a first step for researchers to define their orientation as they enter into a research topic. And then know that there's a set of assumptions that comes with whatever your orientation is, both the epistemology and methodology that you use. But we spent most of the time just talking about what the persistent barriers are that interfere with more culturally responsive research practices. And a major one is just this idea of etic perspectives, or these universalist assumptions about the world, that we often assume that the interventions that we develop will work equally well across people, or the variables that predict outcomes are the same regardless of context. And we make these assumptions often without stating them explicitly. And so they become assumed and to be normal. And so there's examples where that's not true, and there's examples of where those assumptions are damaging and perpetuate structures that wouldn't continue to be persistent without those assumptions. And you included this quote: "You must have liked it, David. Researchers' failure to give careful consideration to the cultural background of participants may lead to ignore inadvertently or deliberately the social structural changes that need to be undertaken by society as a whole for the sake of social justice." There was another quote from that article that I want to emphasize too as I transition to you, David. And that was the idea, I think also by Dumas, that to be culturally responsive requires a lens, an attention to cultural responsivity at each phase or stage of the research process. From the very first formulation of your research question, all the way through just how you disseminate your findings. And I'm going to return to that idea with some more specific thoughts about that after David leads us through this critical race theory and then the measurement issues related to it.
I brought in this article for two reasons. We talked about in the previous article, the one that Keith co-authored. One of the limitations in research in general is this normative structure that we take as researchers. And so I thought it would be good to think about a theory within social sciences that would permit us to point the finger at those structures that Keith was referencing. And critical race theory does a good job, and it's been in the field for 20, 30 years now, trying to not only point the finger, so recognize these normative structures that are leading to some of this damaging effect or re-damaging effect onto people of color, Black people, Indigenous people. And so here, critical race theory, as it says, the central tenets are on race, racism, and white supremacy. And again, this was started through legal scholarship in the 90s or late 80s, and then move into education and other different fields. And slowly started obtaining momentum in the field of, if you will, research. So researchers, qualitative researchers, quantitative researchers starting using critical race theory. Keith, can you move to the next slide?
Yep.
And this is in the early 2000s, and now since then, different authors started integrating this concept of critical race methodology into their research practices. And it emphasizes the concept that Dr. Herman, Keith, emphasized in his paper that we read 2 weeks ago in 2002. That was a 2002 paper. And essentially, Dr. Herman was talking about the notion of emphasizing the assets of students of color rather than the deficits. And what critical race theory does is then the next step would be, can we speak to, as researchers, to these overarching structures of racism and racial inequity, not only within the framing, but also the interpretation and the approach of our methods. And I think that's what Keith was just mentioning a couple of minutes ago. And we're going to continue focusing on, can we recognize and insert ourselves almost like an intervention onto the way we frame, interpret, and do our research. And the final point is that intentionality is, can we be intentional in how we guide our methodological decisions? And the article, I'm not sure if you all got a chance to read it, but Sablon 2017 really provides a balanced, not only approach of providing us a guide of how as researchers we can think about research differently in a critical way, but also it provides us a good idea of what the limitations are and maybe where we can come in as researchers to take on a critical stance. And just to point out the page numbers here from the article, it's essentially the limitations section of the article. But it takes us through what descriptive statistics could do better, experimental designs could do better, and integrating these critical approaches, causal evidence within cultural relevant interventions. And I think that's what even Wes mentioned. He's having a difficulty measuring these cultural interventions. And since early 2010s, scholars have tried to do this. How do we include culturally relevant interventions and how do we measure them appropriately according to this critical lens? Measurement theory is suggested that it needs some work utilizing this critical tenets, so on and so forth. And so the next slide, keep the view in mind. The next, here I'm really wanting us to once again take a step back and think in our own fields. Number one, can we see ourselves inserting, again, this is in the spirit of inclusion and culturally responsive research, and to challenge ourselves, can we see ourselves inserting assets of students of color through the asset perspective as opposed to the deficit perspective? And number two, are we willing, do you think we're able to speak to the overarching structure that Keith mentioned in his earlier work? But critical race theory is asking us to be upfront about it. The structure of racism, racial inequity. And although by saying those things, even though our federal government is banning those type of reflections, I'm wondering if we could still engage in those reflections within our own practice. Anything else, Keith, that you think
Well, so you want us to go into breakout rooms. What are the outcomes that you want us to return with, David?
So again, Keith, I'm not sure how much time we'll have in the breakout rooms, but if we can spend about 7, I know last time we cut the breakout rooms short, but if we can spend a minute or two per person talking about these questions that I have at the bottom. Can you begin inserting assets of students of color rather than deficits? Do you see yourself speaking to the overarching structure of racism and racial inequity? Where we left off last week was that more work needs to be done in our fields. I think that's our overall consensus. More work needs to be done personally, as scholars ourselves. So I'm wondering if we're willing to take just a quick sample look at what would it look like for us to do that.
Okay, so in particular, each of us speak to our own area or interest in research and
Yes.
how we could be more attentive to assets of students, and then more systematically reflect on structures, oppressive structures in our research. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good to me. Anyone have any questions about that? All right, David, you gonna send us into the atmosphere to reunite in breakout rooms?
Yes, I'm going to go. How many people do we have? 13 people. All right.
I just got here, so
Hey, Francis.
And
yeah. So
I think Emily's leaving, so it'll be yeah. Let's do it'll be small groups. This will be random, y'all. So I'm letting Zoom decide which breakout rooms you're going to. You have
Cool.
you have 7 minutes, okay, Keith, and then we come back and do a quick summary.
Sounds good. You're timing us, right, David?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, y'all. Let's go. See you later. And then I will. I guess it gave. I'm learning how to work this break room still. I guess it gave them.
It gives you like a 60-second warning.
I forgot that.
And then
Oh,
I
there we
think it like, kicks you out.
Oh, okay.
I think.
David, you wanna lead this reflection
Yeah.
when we get everybody back? It looks like we're still missing half our crew.
I was able to peek into what you were saying, Keith and Shannon, and then what Wes and Lauren and I believe was Dan were saying. It was really fruitful conversations, and I think I'll stop talking there so that because I want to include them. Is there a way that I can tell them to come back?
Everybody's back now.
Everyone's back now.
Yeah, it gives you a minute. Like when you end it, you get 1 minute, and then it just automatically kicks you out.
Oh, there it is. Lovely. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I feel like as I was listening to Keith, I'm not sure if you heard me say this, but Keith, Shannon, and then Wesley, Dan, and Lauren, although I missed Dan's account, it becomes almost like a personal anecdote of your experience with research and trying to engage your research in equitable ways. And so I want to see if Wes would be comfortable talking just briefly about the one event in 2014 that occurred. And then we can open it up to if anyone else has any summary from the discussion that you all had as a group, or if you want to share the story again. And I think Wes's conversation really speaks to the point of maybe it's important to think about critical lenses and quant. Wes, do you mind sharing?
Sure. So some of you remember the fall of 2015, there was a message posted online that said something hateful about bringing a gun to campus to commit some racist hate crime. And our chair or someone, provost, somebody higher up said something about if you want to cancel classes or something like that, but also be prepared to talk if students want to engage about this if you do have class. And I remembered that I'm a quantitative person. I'm teaching methods classes about numbers, right? There's nothing about any sort of, at least that's how I saw it back then. There's no sort of like anything about society or real issues. It's just numbers. And I've always abstracted them and said like, this is different and numbers are their own thing. And so I remember telling my students, this thing happened today and I understand if you're concerned. This class probably isn't the place to discuss it. I have no qualifications. And I remember I posted like the number for like a counseling crisis, like a call line or whatever. But I totally separated it as, well, now we're talking about numbers. That's a different thing. And I was telling David and Lauren and Dan that there's a book that I've been meaning to read, and some of them have read it, called White Methods, White Logic, or something like that, which says we can't really separate the numbers. The numbers were developed in from a privileged and a racist stance, and lots of statistics come from eugenicists. And I have acknowledged that in class. Literally, my slides are like, Francis Galton developed psychometrics, here's all about him. And then there's an asterisk at the bottom that's like, but also he was a eugenicist, so it's not like he was a great person. But I don't talk about it. I just mention it because I feel weird not acknowledging this heinous part of him. But I just say it just to say like, I'm aware. And if, that's something that we need to keep in mind. But actually integrating it into class, like that's the end of it. That's as far as I get, because I've always separated what I do from any sort of racial lens or focus. And so I certainly need to be better about that. I don't really know how to incorporate it or the degree to which students would agree it's appropriate, or those other sort of thorny issues that I think we all deal with if we're not directly instructing about race issues.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, Wes. I just thought that was poignant example of there are things happening in our society, and as educators that we are, we have been tasked to ignore that or to at least provide a crisis hotline for people to talk about it. And I'm wondering what we could do better to integrate it into whether our curriculum, whether our research, so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll open it up. Keith, I'm not sure how much time we have. Looking at the time, do you?
We could spend another 5 minutes if people want to reflect on this some more. I mean, to that, Wes, I would say those types of challenges. I mean, I'm a counseling and school psychologist. I think there's always going to be a balance. Like I have content to cover, right? And I want to make it, you know, culturally relevant and specific. And sometimes, here's my example that I was thinking of recently, which is every one of our courses can't be constant self-reflection on bias, or can it? I don't know. It seems like we have to get to content as well. So I think there's that tension that I always feel like, how much in what course do I spend on this amount of this content versus just discussion processing? And I could see the tension in a quant course would be especially challenging.
So
Yeah.
I
Go
may
ahead, Wes.
be, I do have limited understanding of CRT in general, but wouldn't critical race theory say that even if we're just focusing on content, it's part of the content?
Yeah,
right?
I agree.
Like, and that's the issue. And so for my courses, it's like, should I actually go into the, you know, eugenics or whatever other problems that have that started statistics as we use them? Like, should I go into it? Is it enough to just mention it? And so it's like, yes, that would be getting away from the content, but it also is the content.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really sure what I'll do in the future. Like, I don't really know where to fit that in, but I don't feel great about just having it as a footnote and moving on.
Yeah, Clark wants to get in here.
Yeah. So again, thanks for letting me join in despite having to run around. I don't know how many of you were on Wes's presentation earlier today, but that in a way provided a model because in discussing the Bayesian analysis and understanding those models, you have to unpack what you're bringing to that model, right? The sort of and I think that's appropriate for this kind of work too. If you're using a data set, and this was in our small group discussion, that uses, you know, a binary gender category. Yeah, that's what you got. That's what you're going to use. That's going to lead to, you know, your tests that you need to run. But you can spend a couple minutes saying, look, this was a data set collected starting in the 70s. Of course, it's going to have only two. Let's talk about that for 2 seconds and understand that that's not what we would do today. But then you work into the you know, the task at hand, which is the analysis. But I do think, you know, bringing all those assumptions, you know, unpeeling exactly what you have to get through to get to the core of the task shouldn't take, I hope, a lot of time, especially if it becomes routine. But to make sure everybody going into that task understand all, you know, the foundation on which it's built, and that often involves systemic racism, antiquated notions of gender and race and ethnicity, and that, you know, it's going to change. We're going to be the old timers in the next decade. So the stuff we think is progressive now is going to be seen as, you know, quaint. So it's good practice for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say that it's like an ongoing process, kind of like, you know, you're constantly changing your course. You're constantly updating the content. And both I teach this semester is public health and research methods. And It's the students understand. Have them understand this from day one, that it's going to be part of the course. It's going to be a discussion throughout the semester, so they know we're constantly looking at these issues. And so, you know, if you're talking about sampling, if you're talking about ethics, even, you know, where hypotheses come from, I think all of it has room for the discussions to come in, and it is almost something that my students at least can relate to more, because they're able to look at things, you know, differently, as like, this is one type of bias in this scenario, like what are others, or, you know, that sort of thing. So I don't know, for me, it's led to rich conversations, but I will say, I do get some negative course evaluations as a result, which is why I start the semester by letting students know what to expect from me, because you will get pushback when you bring these topics into the class, and it's more than just a single class.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there we go. I'd say that this is absolutely something that I struggle with as well. And so, you know, any ideas that I put forward are not, they have not by any means solved anything. So far, the most accessible, or some could even say convenient way I do it, is when I'm describing ideas, I'm trying to bring in other perspectives, examples that are talking about situations or circumstances, or using even events that are kind of multicultural or multi-perspective, add to multiple perspectives. I'm doing this to describe kind of broader conceptual ideas about media psychology, but one of the issues is that the ideas themselves are entrenched in kind of a lot of this, you know, pre-existing, you know, some cases dogma, but in other ways, kind of substandard research practices. And so the question for me tends to be, well, you know, do I can't, as a researcher, redo all of the research that's the foundation of this field. And so, you know, how can I still kind of talk about these ideas and these foundations in ways that do not reify some of these kind of pre-existing structures, that do not kind of tap into the very thing that I'm trying to avoid? How can I do that without kind of having a lot of new ideas to kind of base that off of? And so that's one aspect for me where the struggle continues is, you know, I'm readily able to kind of use examples and try to kind of create a more inclusive environment and multiple perspectives in that way. But the ideas themselves are where a lot of the issues are entrenched in. And that is clearly a much larger challenge in terms of, you know, kind of accomplishing these goals, taking this culturally responsive approach to teaching and even research.
Lauren, you were nodding pretty vigorously there. What were your reactions to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's because that's kind of the foundation that I teach my students. And to understand science, you need to understand that it's accumulation of knowledge, and that knowledge is based largely in structural issues. And, you know, what drives science is based on societal, you know, under like issues at that time. And it's been driven largely by, you know, white male ideas and what matters to them. And so it's just this constant battle where I keep reminding students, you know, you've got to understand the history and the context for every question that's asked, because it is a huge issue. In my own work on trans people, I'm constantly fighting this battle of the entire foundation of our scholarship is based on HIV stigma and behaviors that were deemed deviant. And so I'm constantly fighting this battle of, I'm not starting over. And I want to nod to these theories that, you know, are our foundation, but they're not good theories. And so it's like, how do I move over when you can't start over? So I'm with you. it is the constant problem that I'm always talking about to my students, though, is like, it's where those questions come from, and would those questions be asked differently? Because we have to rely on what's already known,
Mm-hmm.
but they have to understand where it came from.
Mm-hmm. So as I reflect on some of that, I've thought about this often too. Is so if our knowledge developed so far is flawed, and we acknowledge it, but there's hopefully some truth, some version of truth in what is known. I sometimes reflect on, like, there's some things that I really do believe to be true based on theories that I use or evidence that I've collected. But what would I be willing to give up? Like, I mean, how could I ever really accept that these ideas were wrong? You know, there are some things that are really tight here, and there's some that I'm open to. I mean, that's a place I think for all of us to reflect on. And if there's something you're not willing to give up, like that's interesting, right? Like that's powerful. So.
Well, you get into the quant classes, you know, back to Wes's point, it's like, you know, I'm trying to hand them a tool to utilize. So I'm giving you a hammer to go out and do things. I'm giving you, you know, this tool that's going to help you do good work. But then having to realize, like, who made the tool, right? The tool's still the tool. It's still there. It can still do great things. You know, it could make differences in research, like what we're talking about right now. If we, you know, enable individuals that want to do this type of work and push theories beyond what we're doing right now, these tools are what's going to help do that. But then recognizing who built the tools is sort of problematic as well too, right? And so that's, I think that was where Wes was coming in. It's like, I just need to sort of train on how to use this tool, and hopefully then you can take it and go out and do the type of things that we want to have happen and the change that we want to have occur. But it is difficult then to insert some of these elements into that process of just getting to know the tool. Yeah, so, and I think it goes along with what you're saying. You're like, that truth, there's some truth there. And you know, the theorists or whoever came up with it, yeah, so that's a problem, could be a problem, right? But it's sort of like, oh, that's still like a worthwhile tool that I see that has the ability to serve, you know, beyond the individual who created it, I guess.
Yeah, so I feel for you guys, but try and let me amplify your challenge. Picture yourself being a first grade teacher who's charged with teaching kids to read, right? That's a tool. That's a task. And yet they're operating in a systemic organizational structure that perpetuates lots of problems. So they daily have to try and navigate that balance. And they do. And there's good models, I think, for how to do that. But I don't know. Lauren, you had another comment?
No, I don't know that I want to go here. Because it's the best example I can come up with, because it was the first time I had been in a classroom in several years. But I tried to take a class over the summer at Mizzou. And what I wanted from the class was to be able to apply these theories to my own work, with the, you know, marginalized population. And I got 3 weeks into the class and I was bringing up these issues of these theories don't necessarily fit for this population. And then I started realizing there's all these papers on just why it's a problem. And when I brought it into the classroom, all I got was, you know, well, but if you help white people, won't it help all other people? And I'm like, whoa, that's, you know, an issue. But what I was noticing was every single author that I had to read about, like from every single video I was watching, was a white male. And for me, that was that moment of realizing this theory, this is a great theory. It does not apply to marginalized groups, and no one's willing to hear it. You know, the fact that there was just no room for it kind of made me realize, like, there's room for things to change and evolve. And I think it's the burden. And it was like, because I got so angry, I started reading all these articles. The burden falls on the researchers who do that work to make it fit, to bring it over, to talk about why it doesn't fit. And I think that there's a lot of resistance on the other hand. And so, like, I think about, read a paper yesterday and I was like, yeah, this is the normal 80% white. That's okay because that's acceptable because we know that's all we can get and that sort of thing. And so there's just this constant perpetuation even now with science, and we're not moving it forward because it's the status quo and we've got to get things done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I think. Oh, go ahead. Who was going to talk? Was it just me? Sorry. So, I mean, I think this tension that we're describing, I mean, we're talking about teaching, but we're talking about knowledge, where it comes from and how we teach it. And I think the tension is there is because it's the solution is going to be on a continuum, and the solution is going to be contextualized as well, you know, in the classroom versus what I write in my scholarship, how I present it. And so in our last couple minutes here, I want to turn to that topic, like how can we think about and have a tool where we can self-reflect on our work, our scholarship along a continuum. Like I'm never going to be a perfect culturally responsive researcher, but hopefully my work leans that direction strongly, right? And so how do we evaluate ourselves and other people's work in relationship to some gold standard? And so I came across an article, I'll send it to you, David. I didn't have time I came across it today. So I'll share it with the group later, but I just want to give a quick summary sort of as we move forward in this conversation. And I'll share my screen again. And let's see, cycle through this. This was an article I came across in the field of special education, and special ed is cool because they're really good at operationalizing things. Like they are behaviorists and they want to give a clear definition to things that they measure. And so this was an article in a special ed journal about what is culturally responsive research. And so as we go forward as a group, I want us to start thinking about what culturally responsive research is in each phase of research. And so we could think about 3 phases. These authors came up, and I'll show you in the next slide, with 15 different phases of research that they want us to consider. That seems like a lot to me, but let's start with 3. But this whole idea from the inception to research design, I mean, Lauren, you're talking a lot about the theories that guide your work. This is the critical element, right? As you're designing a study, as you're thinking about what the problem is, as you're thinking about the levers related to solutions, that our theories are often not rooted in a culturally responsive ideology. And so these researchers were talking about, this is their orientation towards the inception and design phase, what is important. They say that culturally responsive research demands rigorous attention to the personal experiences, cultural practices, and assumptions bring to the project in concert with the basic scientific principle of linking research to theory. This idea too, we could reflect on, but something for you to reflect on in our future conversations. These people say that you have to include members of the participant community at all stages of research. That means consulting with them as you're designing the study. That means disseminating with them, not just to them. At the implementation phase, they talk about the design of instruments and other intervention components that are reliable, valid, and culturally consonant. Now, this idea of doing studies based on existing data sets, I struggle with this because I have access to a ton of data sets, and you're at the mercy of whoever designed the original study in terms of the measures that they use. And sometimes they capture a culturally relevant construct, sometimes they don't. But they also talk about considering in the implementation the locales in which the intervention is likely to be implemented and larger societal factors that are linked to that. And this dissemination, I like some of this phrasing, dissemination of research should result in its use. Dissemination of research should result in its use, right? I don't know if we always think about that. And use by whom? We often care about other researchers citing our work, right? But these authors talk about attention to use in this approach, understands the local political and socio-historical context in which people live so that it's disseminated in ways that's helpful to those community participants that were involved in your study. Now, these are ideas that are strong in qualitative research traditions usually, but often are not in quant-oriented research. So this rubric, they came up with a rubric. It's messy. It's very detailed, so don't pay attention. I just gave you one screenshot of 3 pages of this rubric. And these are the authors, and I appreciate it because it gives us something to think about. It's maybe a little much for me, but I'll share it with you and we can reflect on it for our next discussion. But these are the different domains that they want us to rate ourselves on in terms of how culturally responsive our research is, which is really defining what the construct is that we're interested in, or constructs, and to, as we write about it in our reports, talk about the construct from multiple perspectives and competing ideas. They talk about the relevancy of the problem to the community of interests. So is this just a topic that I'm interested in that's consistent with my line of inquiry, and I'm what's it called, tricking participants to be part of my study? Are participants wanting to be part of my study because they agree it's a meaningful and relevant problem? Some other pieces here, again, Lauren, back to you, this justification of theory. Does this theory I'm using, does it address these sociocultural, social, political, and historical context? This was interesting. They talk about it when you describe your participants. Are you not only describing your participants, your individuals, but do you also describe the institutional dimensions of which your study took place? Describing the researchers and the interventionists, I do that, but I don't always do what the relational position between me and the interventionist was, sort of the power dynamic there. We won't go through all of these, but just gives you a different sense of the things that they think at every phase that we should be thinking of. This analysis interpretation phase, they talked about when you analyze and interpret your findings, there's 3 levels, which is culture blind, that you don't attend to culture in your analysis or interpretation. There's culture deterministic, so you may include covariates of different aspects of culture, but they're treated as static and categorical dimensions rather than dynamic dimensions. And so in their hierarchy, cultural instrumentalists would be to try to capture something dynamic about the cultural aspect of the study that you're interested in highlighting. All right, so that was about it. Thoughts, reactions to any of that in our last moment here?
Wow.
You
That
like
was a lot
that?
to take in quick, Keith.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm giving it to you to prime the pump for our next conversation. I think we'll share this for next week.
Perfect.
And come back. And what I would like us to do in our next sort of subgroup discussion would be maybe to divide into 3 groups and look at this, but come up with our own sort of definition of what should you be doing at each of these phases at a minimum to be attentive to the cultural dimensions of our work.
That sounds good.
Sounds like
So you can probably tell already, I like to share what my biases are, but one of my biases is to be solution focused. And so I like us, not just to dwell in the problem, but like, okay, what are we going to do about it? So I steer us in that way. You need to let me know if I'm steering too strong in that direction.
sounds like a good plan.
All right, folks, thanks for joining again this week. I'm enjoying the conversation. So 2 weeks we'll meet again, and David will share this article with you for our next discussion.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for putting everything together, David and Keith.
Yeah. Good to see you.